And it's been great hearing about all the work that's kind of been inspired by or is using the CSD and the associated products. And it's good to have this opportunity to say a few words about the person who started it all, Dr. Olga Kennard. And this is based on a talk that I gave at the American Chemical Society meeting in the spring, where we were celebrating the life and legacy of Olga after she passed away last year, just short of her 99th birthday. If you're paying attention at the beginning as well, you'll remember that Jason showed a slide with a quote that we like to use about how the database was established to fulfill a dream of Olga and J.D. Barnell about the collective use of data and how that could lead to discovery that transcends the results of individual experiments. That quote actually comes from probably one of the last presentations that Olga gave before she retired from the CCDC. And it was given at a workshop looking at the impact of electronic publishing on the academic community as the world was in 1997. And I'm going to use that as a source for this presentation and some of the things he said. I've actually got a proof of it here with Olga's handwriting on it as well. I suspect some of this paper might be older than some of the people in this room. Olga made no secret of the fact that she was very much inspired by J.D. Burnell. And so the other source that I'm going to use is her Burnell lecture that she gave in 1995. Data in form of observations, experimental or experienced, is the basis of all science and much of human knowledge, except possibly mathematics, philosophy, and religion. That's how Olga opened her Burnell lecture in 1990. What year did I say? 5. She then went on to talk a little bit about J.D. Burnell, highlighting how as far back as the 1940s, he foresaw the coming information explosion and the valuable knowledge that we might be able to derive from that. And from this came this belief that it would be worthwhile embarking on the long and tedious process of capturing information and developing tools to enable its utilization. Olga then went on to sort of reflect on the information explosion as it looked like in 1995, and she hypothesized that Burnell's prediction was very much confirmed, and that at that time we were living in an age of information, bombarded by an ever-increasing tide of facts, data, opinions, and surmises, information pouring out by newspapers and onto computer screens and into offices, and soon perhaps linked by the information superhighway into homes. And interesting, she noted there forecasts about the destruction of the environment. Said, in the face of this deluge, it has been hard to formulate any well-founded opinion. My reflections in 2024. We're living in an age of big data and AI. We're bombarded by social media and clickbait. Got information not just in our homes, but on our phones, on our home devices. We're still debating issues around the climate change, and perhaps never has it been easier to formulate and disseminate ill-founded opinions. Whether things have improved, perhaps that's a discussion for later. Olga went on to unpack the information explosion, looking at various studies that had been done, sort of looking at the sort of growth of various publications and things like that. Interesting, she noted that idealism about the goals and beneficial effects of science is being followed by disillusion with science and an anti-scientific culture. And maybe we've seen some of that in the wake of the pandemic, people are developing an unhealthy suspicion of science. But she noted that although the restrictions on funding slowing down the rate of the growth of people to work on research programs, productivity was actually increasing as a consequence of technological developments. She highlighted in particular the developments in computing were making it easy to store large quantities of information and be able to search that rapidly and effectively. And she called out in particular visualization as being a very important part, particularly of crystallography, because few people are able to think about structures in 3 dimensions. I think that aspect remains very important to us today. This little particular animation I was able to make at 30,000 feet on the way over to the ACS meeting because I hadn't finished my slides yet. But she went on to also cast some shade over architects. This building is a testament for Olga's interest in architecture. She said, alas, this is even true of architects designing buildings who could do well in making full use of the 3D virtual reality, which can be created by computers. And today, I'm sure architects are using this on a daily basis. This model here was developed from just a 2D floor plan of a property in the space of just about a few days. She went on to talk about dissemination of results. the way in which results of scientific projects are disseminated has not as yet changed radically. And this was despite all these advances in the means of communication and electronic networks. And she went on to say some perhaps astute comments about publishers, about how astute publishers were mindful that they had a lucrative business that they did not want to disrupt. But she said there were signs of a revolution in the publication of results. Scientists may well bypass traditional journals and publish on the World Wide Web without the intervention of editors and printers. But the problem of refereeing then looms large, as there's the prospect of the superhighway being choked by second-rate or erroneous papers, and that's a possible threat to the integrity of reporting scientific results. She went on to talk about how the CCDC, or the data center, had become a vital party in the refereeing process. Contribution and development of check programs to help individual scientists to ensure that their data was to at least some degree validated. But concerns that there was much discussion about the loss of quality control if results are placed directly on the web. Now, at that time, there were around 479 private communications in the CSD, what we now today call CSD communications. And there's quite a lot more of those in the database today, with over 51,000 by the end of 2023. We're also seeing power structures being associated with preprints that not yet been published and reviewed in peer-reviewed journals. So this is close to this thing of structures, kind of that concern about quality if data is just published on the web. But it's not just the web that we have to worry about today. Some of you will be aware that a couple of years ago, somebody unearthed the paper mill, which is basically a scheme where people were essentially fabricating papers to get publications that would help them advance their career, and making claims that were very spurious, had very sort of spurious scientific basis. And a lot of these had some relationship to metal organic frameworks, and they had data sets associated with them. And so we too have to carry on today thinking about the validity of the data, making sure that we're doing the checks to make sure that the data that goes into the CSD is not just accurate, but also valid. And so we have a number of measures in place and workflows and processes that try to make sure that what's going into try to assure the integrity of the CSD. Olga talked about validation of data at the CSD 50 celebration, where she came and gave a talk. We were very pleased that she came along to do that, and that would have been the first time that she'd really come out and talked about the CST in public since her retirement. And there she sort of talked about how one of the early things that was done there was sort of taking the sort of numbers, because we have to remember here that when a structure was published, it would have been printed in a journal, and then when it came to CCDC, those coordinates would be retyped. So there was a need for sort of automated checks, not just to check that there weren't transcription errors, but often to find errors in the data as it was originally published. And she notes you'd be surprised just how many errors there were at that time. But I think this sort of like middle bullet point here about having a well-defined aim of using the numbers for a specific purposes made this checking all the more essential. And Olga went on to talk a little bit then about reuse of data and some of the things that were done early on in the development of the CSD to enable that reuse. And one of the simple ones here was just thinking about the coordinates that are presented to users when they use the database in our tools. As crystallographers, you'll know that what comes out are the fractional coordinates. That might be great if you're a crystallographer, but if you're a chemist, seeing half a benzene molecule isn't going to be very useful to you. And so that's why from a very early stage, the CSD presented a complete chemical unit as the CSD entry and transferred those coordinates to Cartesian ones, so other people didn't have to do that. The other thing that Olga noted was the importance of correlating a reliable chemical representation with the 3D crystallographic data. And this is absolutely essential to sort of enable the search and the analysis and the reuse of data that we will have heard about throughout today, and is very much a core part of our kind of editorial workflows. And Olga noted that this contributed greatly to the rapid take-up of using the systems by communities outside of crystallography. Now, the example I've used here is penicillin. And this is the example that Olga used in both her Bernal lecture and the workshop contribution to explain to an audience of non-crystallographers what crystallography was all about. And it would have been no accident that she chose penicillin, because she was using here a structure that was determined by Dorothy Hodgkin, who was very much an inspiration and supporter of Olga throughout her career. When I joined CCDC, down in the basement on one of the walls, there was a picture of Dorothy Hodgkin, where today you'll find meeting rooms. Then there was a little laboratory that had been built into the, that had been designed into the building. So Olga could continue her research into nucleotide chemistry with a small research group. This is probably the last publication that came out of her time at the CCDC. Looking at four-stranded DNA motif. There's a few interesting things to note about this. This was published at a time where to get a publication in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, you had to have your paper recommended. In this case, this was recommended by Arnold Burgin, who went on to be Olga's second husband. The other thing I know would be the sort of like, the international collaboration that was going into this work. I mean, although it was driven from Cambridge, we had collaborators from Germany and Spain as well. And the other interesting thing, I think Steve Salisbury, the first named author here, when I joined, he was sort of part of that research group. He went on to be business director of CCDC. And I think, the kind of institution, the organization that Olga built has always been one that is very open into sort of like developing people's careers in various different ways and identifying opportunities along those lines. This reflects itself, I think, a little bit in the fellowship that was set up in Olga's name on her retirement. She was interviewed about this and asked whether the special provisions in there around women were influenced by her own experiences. Her inspiration, I think, came much more from the Dorothy Hodgkin Fellowship, which was just looking more generally towards early career researchers, allowing for flexibility due to personal circumstances. But the quote's lovely as far as I'm concerned, because you can sort of see that she's just basically saying back to the interviewer, you're being very presumptuous here. The other aspect of this, I think, is that it shows that Olga was just not one for excuses, least so from herself. And I think that's, if you look through the sort of trajectory of her career, she wasn't someone who was going to let her personal issues get in the way of getting on developing her scientific and professional life. In her Barnard lecture, Olga talked about protein structures. And again, we look at the time that this lecture was given, the small number of protein structures that there were in the PDB compared to today. But even then, there was this promise that by collecting together this data, combining it together with the sort of developments in technology, that the possibilities of being able to predict 3D structures that kind of like without having to do direct experiment. And so Olga described the sort of state of the art of 3D protein structure prediction at that particular time, understanding how structures fold to sort of form a stable three-dimensional structure, looking at the information and then feeding that into a set of rules that can be used to maybe computationally predict secondary structure. Now, I got to experience some of these workflows at a training course, and what I remember is it was very kind of, despite using the sort of automated processes, it was very manual, and you had to sort of look at the results and transform them to go from one stage to the next. Fast forward today, boom, AI, machine learning, and AlphaFold, and we have, a massive database of predicted protein structures. But it's important to remember that that would only have happened, could only have happened because we had collected that experimental data to train the models that has enabled that. And as this article notes, it doesn't take away the need for experimental data. The reality is that you're going to have modifications, different kind of like configurations due to the environment, and you kind of need that experimental data to be able to refine neural models in order to sort of come up with something that really is realistic and useful. When it came to small molecule data, Olga talked about how an important function for a data bank, as she used it, was reducing collections of individual data sets to generalized sets of constant rules. She used as kind of foundational examples of this building knowledge bases of bond lengths and intermolecular forces. Essentially, sort of in the early days of the CCDC, there was work done by Frank Allen, Robin Taylor, Guy Orpen, coming up with these tables of bond dimensions that were at the time published in articles, but would be used to sort of parameterize different programs and force fields. At the time this was taking place, we were talking with a guy called Bob Perlman, who wrote one of the first 2D to 3D converters. At that time, the challenge was just to get one good 3D model out of it. Today, of course, we've got conformer generators that can generate you hundreds in matters of seconds. But again, here it's that idea that the knowledge taken from the CSD can be used to help parameterize those and make them even better. So in the sort of final section of this talk, I'm going to talk about aspects to do with the dissemination of the data, less to do with the science. And in her Bernal note, in her workshop contribution, Olga said, free access to validated and enhanced data worldwide is a beautiful dream. The reality, however, is more complex. One of the complexities that she highlighted was the issue of data standardization. Now, 1992, I think, was the year that the sort of first SIF paper was published, and CCDC had been contributing to that. I was intrigued by this comment about how this raises too many problems to consider in detail here. We're currently in the process of trying to define standards for predicted crystal structure data. It'd be really useful to know what those problems were and how they were overcome. Was then the issue of distribution of data. When I joined CCDC, the way that the CSD was distributed was that we'd make some magnetic tapes and then we send them to various different centers around the world, and they'd take copies of them tapes and send them out to all the institutions that wanted to use it. Olga notes that kind of like individual access to individual data items might be served by electronic networks, but at that time the sort of ability to sort of really do in-depth research really required having the data installed in individual labs. And it was that led to this network of affiliated centers who took the responsibility for the copying. When this talk would have given, we would have been sending them CD-ROMs to send out to their labs. But the strength of this was these centers wasn't just in their distribution ability, it was also in understanding the needs of the local community and being able to channel funds that are adjusted to the size of the country's scientific population in order to support the CSD. And she also noted that the sort of policies behind this were introduced in the 1970s, in particular to make sure that younger scientists were able to have access to the database. This sort of resonates through today. We still have a network of affiliated centers that's probably smaller number now than there were then, but we try to use those to sort of like make access as sort of barrier free as possible in certain regions. We also have our network of CSD champions who advocate for use of the CSD around the world. And then in honor of Frank Allen, who at the time was deputy director and went on to lead the organization, we have a program geared at supporting use of the CSD in lower income regions. The other aspect of the finances that Olga talked about was income coming from industrial companies. And I think for a long time, I thought this was more a necessity rather than a desire. But I think reading more of what Olga wrote, I think she actually became sort of, the belief that this was a very strong positive model to have this dual income coming from both academia and industry and not relying on grants, because there was too much risk that those could just go away and thus the resources that were being produced could no longer be sustained. And at the time, I think she was probably had very much at the front of her mind the risk that sort of came up to SwissProt, which is a large database of enzyme nomenclature that was at risk as disappearing because the grant that was funding that was being withdrawn. There was an article that was written that suggested that maybe the biological community would have to turn to look at models like the CCDC. As it happened, it was saved and lived on under some other form. But I think the other strength of this sort of dual model is the contact that CCDC has with both academic and its industry communities. And the picture here is taken from our Crystal Form Consortium meeting that took place this year, where we had people from industry coming together, sort of continuing a 15-year tradition of informing the materials tools, some of which we've heard talked about here, and making sure that they're relevant for industry problems. So this leads me to some concluding remarks. The picture shown there was taken just over there. I think it was Olga's 70th birthday because there was cake. So I think that would have mean that it has been about 1994. The conclusions here really are sort of just drawn almost directly from Olga's own thoughts. I think the first one is interesting. I think she was basically saying there is no excuse for not providing access to data and deriving the knowledge that based on technology, the technological developments are keeping pace with the growth of information. So technology should not be considered a barrier. What is important though is having data curators to anticipate potential areas, and I think also think about the reuse of the data downstream. So developing the validation tools that ensure reliability, enhancing data to enable reuse, and thinking about how we can reduce the labor that needs to go into research by the development of knowledge bases and other things. And by channeling resources, data banks have ensured that information once gained is not lost. Now, it might be interesting to think, what would Olga say today? The closest we can get to that is some comments that she shared in 2021 when she was interviewed on the occasion of getting the Ewald Prize for contributions to crystallography. At the time, she could not anticipate a time when such data could become superfluous. Even though we know a lot of theory now, purely theoretical structure predictions are not likely to take over from good experimental data. Thinking more broadly, maybe a less positive sort of like perception here. In her late 90s, she was avidly using the internet and enjoying the power of computing, but mourned the fact that the explosion of scientific knowledge that's out there was not fully being made use to ensure the future viability of our planet and civilization. Whatever one might think, I think Olga herself has done a lot did a lot in founding the CCDC and the CSD to make sure that we have every chance of making use of the information and knowledge that can come from crystallography and structural chemistry. Another quote we like to use, and this one does come from her Barnard lecture, is that there's a great ocean of truth still in front of us and that we'll continue to discover new aspects of that truth. But she actually went on to say a little bit more. Some of it might be discovered by kind of like outstanding individuals, but for us mere mortals, we have that opportunity through the analysis and transformation of pebbles of information to sort of help discover those new aspects and insights. And I think it's very much the sort of foundation of the CCDC and the establishment of the CSD that has enabled a lot of the research that we've heard about today in all sorts of different areas. So with that, I'd just like to thank Olga for her original sort of foresight and vision, and you for your attention.